Hello, ladies. We are in module 3, and I would like, as I always do, to highlight some of the things that I think would be very important for us to remember in chapter 3 and module 3 of this second language acquisition course. All right, so in this module, we will talk about individual differences in second language learning. And I would like to reframe it in a slightly different way. So it will tell us what we can't control. We, by we, I mean teachers, and what we as teachers can control. And the article does a very good job explaining some of the things that may find us puzzled. So, why this chapter matters and why do we even have to talk about individual differences? So, as we talked in both modules, module 1 and module 2, that the rate of learning can be very different, and the rate of learning can depend on other things. It could be the age when you start learning a second language. Um, it could be sometimes if you are learning a language that's very similar to yours, and you can transfer all of those skills from one language to another. So there's different rates of progress. However, what if you have two students and they are exposed to the same instruction? They have been in this country during the same period of time. Yes, they may have different participation patterns. One is more extroverted, more engaged, seems to be very socially oriented, and the other one is kind of quiet, and yet they're still in the same classroom. You're still teaching them the same way. However, the results are different. So, this is our question. So, we're trying to explain why some students are not learning as fast as we would want them to do, whereas other students are learning much faster. And this is where we land to the question of individual differences. And the individual differences we're talking in this chapter are motivation, aptitude, anxiety, and personality traits. So, I want to introduce a slightly different metaphor today, and this is the metaphor of the shadows. This is why I have all the different shadows on the slide. You can guess by looking at those shadows, you can guess that they are some plants. Maybe this is a lily, this is a bonsai, maybe this is a fir tree, or it could be a rhododendron, it could be or a palm tree. You see, and you are trying to guess what plant that is. This is exactly the way it is with this individual differences, with this personality traits, with motivation, with aptitude. They are not clearly and directly observable. We're only making inferences based on student behavior. And the worst part of it, or the best part of it, they are also very interrelated. Like the student can be both motivated and very extroverted at the same time. And we don't really know what is it that draws the success or what pulls the and boosts the English language learning. And also they're very context dependent. This is why I have two masks. That in some situations students are motivated to speak English, and in other situations not so much. In some situations they feel very comfortable and confident, and they really want to sit and chat with their partners at the table. However, coming up front, not so much. So this is exactly why we have this metaphor of shadows. One more thing to remember about individual differences is how researchers, or how we as researchers, because I do firmly believe that teachers should participate in research studies, not only as participants, but as designers and leaders of those research studies. So, how can we get an idea, or how can we measure those individual differences? And this is where we have to depend a lot on questionnaires, surveys, indirect observation measures. And also, oftentimes we run into the problem that if we want to see how those individual differences have an impact on um, rate of learning or English language proficiency, so we have to use some set data sets that would include test results or exit ticket results or any other sorts of measures that measure English language proficiency. However, oftentimes, so even if we found out those that the student or the person possesses certain individual traits like motivation, it would be integral motivation, instrumental motivation, or any other type of individual trait. And also we have the language test. Then what we can do as researchers, we can correlate and see if both of them rise or if both one of them goes down, or if it's the inverted correlation that anxiety rises and language proficiency and achievement goes down. So we are correlating them, but correlation does not mean causation. And I understand that this may be something that you've heard already so many times, yet I'll still bring this key example with ice cream and people drowning. That in the summer, the sales of ice cream go up, and the drowning rate also goes up. So they're correlated. Ice cream is sold more, people are drowning more. Can we assume that it's the ice cream that causes the people drowning? Not really. There could be another underlying factor, which is the heat. So the heat and the summer days actually cause people to buy ice cream more often. But at the same time, this heat also causes people to go for a swim more often. So they swim more, and as a result, they drown more. So always have to keep this in mind. The same thing is true for participation, perceived motivation, and proficiency. We never know which way the causation goes. It could be that the person is more proficient in the language, so they feel more motivated to practice it, and as a result, they participate more. Or it could be that the person just wants to participate more and is social by nature, and the more the person participates, the more he or she is motivated to learn the language, and it drives the language proficiency. So this is why I have the arrows that can go both ways. We don't know the direction, it's very unclear. And since we can't really plug it into the experiment and see, and we can't have a control group, that there are too many variables involved. We can only rely on inferences based on correlation. The important motive of this chapter is that observed traits, whatever you see in behavior, cannot explain outcomes on their own. So let's start talking about some myths that the chapter is trying to debunk. And one of them is that about, sorry, I think I started too fast. So one of them is that about aptitude. I think I have not heard, well, I think the American context is where I've heard this phrase very often. And it's not only about languages. People say that, oh, I'm not good with languages. Or people dismiss the idea, oh, I'm not good with math. I'm not a math person. So it is always perceived as something fixed and something that cannot really be changed. Some of it is true, but not all of it. So the early research studies about aptitude go back to John Carroll. And I think I am a firm believer that if you are reading about the study, it is always not only important to focus on the findings, so what did they find, but also how they conducted the study, the context, the research context matters a lot, especially in English language education. So if we talk about Carroll, John Carroll developed the modern language aptitude test. That test was used in military trainings and adult foreign language classrooms. It was early, like late 50s, early 60s, when primarily people were focused on grammar, like grammar based programs of language acquisition, audiolingual instruction. So you have to listen, go to the lab, listen, repeat the phrases after the speaker, a lot of again, a lot of grammar, and the context required rapid learning. Also, because this is military training, so the goal was to get those soldiers or those officers to learn the language as fast as possibly can. So, sure, the test was useful because this is how you could probably sift through the officers who are more likely to learn the language and be deployed as fast as possible. Again, the context really explains how we came to this. And aptitude was understood as a rate of learning. However, this is not our context in which we work. And even Carroll conceptualized aptitude as componental, not a single trait. You can also guess, so if it was a lot of grammar-based instruction and audiolingual, that working memory was probably the linking factor between the aptitude, the rate of learning, and language proficiency. That some people are just learning the rule, or it could also be that people are learning the rules faster if they are explained the rules, if those rules are explained explicitly, rather than when they are presented with context and they have to think through or formulate those rules for themselves. So, what we need to know about the aptitude, that aptitude is a real thing. However, it is not a single trait. It has multiple cognitive resources. What it means that involves working memory, language analytic ability, and learners can use it differently depending on the context. We also need to remember, and this is Peter Skihan, who formulated the limited capacity framework, that sometimes in different contexts, like the working memory, the real overload um, is that learners have to be accurate, fluent, and also use complex language. This may or may not happen. This is why there are always trade offs. The student may sacrifice complexity for fluency, or may sacrifice accuracy again for fluency. Um, Depending on what's on the agenda for the learner at this given context. Like when they speak quickly, they often do sacrifice accuracy because they need to get their point across as fast as they possibly can. Complexity also can easily be sacrificed. Also, another important thing to remember is that instruction can reduce aptitude differences, especially like remember those studies that are mentioned in the chapter that when you match the students and their aptitude, like their language ability with the instruction they're getting, you're getting the best results. But also, you need to remember that if some people really like being explicitly told grammar rules, how they measure the results, they measure the results on self assessment questionnaires, which are not always reliable. At the same time, this is the only measurement we can have. Um, Thinking if right. So the key measurement that yes, aptitude is a real thing. It matters. but good instruction matters more. So and since it is not visible to match students and their aptitude, like their working memory, their language ability, analytic ability to the instruction, the role of the teachers is to have as many varied task designs as possible. So the teachers cannot control aptitude, but they definitely can control the tasks and variety of those tasks. Motivation. This is my favorite topic. If I told you that my doctoral education was in motivation, you probably would believe me. I do love talking about motivation. However, there is often what I hear in schools. Oh, the student is unmotivated, or the student is lacking motivations. That motivation, this is why he or she can't succeed. So pretty much the myth has it that motivation causes learning, that if you're motivated, you will succeed, you will learn, you will do whatever is required of you. So you will be a language learner, language learning ninja. Also, what there is another proxy for motivation, and that's participation. So if a student is not participating, oftentimes teachers, even veteran teachers, take it for low motivation. And motivation did used to be treated as a stable trait, and it goes to Gardner and Lambert's studies in the early 70s and early 80s, where they came up with, again, that was a questionnaire, and they came up with two types of motivation. And the motivation was integrative and instrumental. The integrative motivation was the student had a motivation to learn a foreign language because they really wanted, in one way or another, associate with the country where that language is spoken or with the people who speak that language. Again, speaking about the context, that was in Canada, and they were here. This is where my memory fails me. I'm pretty sure they were the ones who were either looking at the French speaking Canadians willing to learn English or the English speaking Canadians willing to learn French. I think the first one is closer to the truth, but I'm not sure. And I didn't look it up today. So, anyways, the instrumental motivation was the motivation that drives students to learn the language for some instrumental purpose, to get a better grade, to get a good job, has nothing to do with the culture or being associated with the people speaking that language, more about being pragmatic in reaching one's goal. Also, they suggested that if you have integrative motivation, or learners with integrative motivation succeed better. This is not exactly true, and this is what other studies have found, that motivation is not a stable trait. And this is what Lightbound and Spada persuasively argue using Zoltan Dorney's studies. You will see, if you ever do a research on second language motivation, Zoltan Dorney is the person that you will see over and over again. Again, he's Hungarian, and after he wrote a dissertation on second language motivation, he moved into theological studies and wrote a second dissertation about theology. That's not the point. But what you need to remember is that again, motivation was measured and was assessed by a series of questionnaires where people were asked, or students were asked, about their perception of themselves, their ideal selves, how they see themselves in the future, and it was primarily based on the psychological concept and the tension between my present self and my ideal self. And if my ideal self includes language in it, or being able to speak that language, that this is what drives my present self to engage in learning. He included well, his studies included a lot of co-authors who he used to, and he conducted his studies like he started in Hungary with the students learning English, and then he expanded to other parts of the world. He has co-authors where they um, asked Japanese students and also tried to include languages other than English, not only focus on English as the only foreign language being learned. What he found is that motivation is dynamic, that the same student can respond differently to the same questions on the same questionnaire depending on the context after a particular task. That motivation changes across tasks and moments. And it is also influenced by successes and access, access to participation. So it's more of a wave going up and down. And a better question to ask is not whether a student is motivated, but how motivating is the student? So compared to the ninja sitting at the desk learning and a woman sitting in an armchair and learning probably the same thing, that her context may be more motivating and she's more likely to exhibit higher or demonstrate higher language achievement. A couple other things were personality and anxiety, that here we conflict two beliefs that extroverts learn better. Not really. No single trait predicts success. Quiet students aren't really engaged. Again, not really. They may be quiet because they're anxious in the moment. Or if they're quiet, it doesn't mean that they're not learning. Maybe they're listening and taking everything in. And some students just lack confidence. Okay, another person who is important to remember in this list of all the names is McIntyre. He is the one who introduced the term willingness to communicate, WTS. He did not conduct observational studies, so his research was primary um, theoretical, and he built the whole pyramid of learning that at the bottom that truly that students so he didn't just give learners a personality test or label them willing or unwilling. So he drew conclusions from correlational studies and conceptual modeling, um, and later classroom-based observations. But again, he was pretty much the takeaway is that it is very situational. That students, one and the same student, may or may not be willing to communicate depending on what the task is and also how emotionally safe the student feels at that particular moment. So he was tying willingness to communicate to the psychological and cognitive perceptions of the context. Um, Bonnie Norton linked, that was looking at the same idea that the student may be very, very motivated. And however, the student or the learner, language learner, would not participate, would not engage in learning or speaking, would not engage in speaking English, depending on the context. What we, her study is foundational, not foundational, but she brings a slightly different perspective on motivation. She links it to identity, power, and investment. What she did is she followed 6 women who immigrated to Canada in the course of the year, and she observed them and she interviewed them. And she was struggling with the question, how come when the students or when those learners, those women who are very motivated to learn English and to succeed, they would speak English and they would participate, for example, in tasks and activities that allow them to show their agency. Like they would go and talk to the teachers at school. However, at work, especially given that they had very low, not low income, but lower rank work, like cleaning or waitressing, they would purposefully choose not to speak English. And of course, she came with, she brought in Bourdieu's concept of investment and the sociology into the English language learning and research. And she said that power shapes participation, that learners, if they feel powerless, they do not participate. However, if they feel powerful and feel that their agency, that they can show their agency and their agency actually does matter, will participate. So I may keep on going. However, this is what I want you to take away from here, that we can't control aptitude, we can't control motivation, we can't control their personality traits. However, what we can control if the task is linguistically accessible. We can control the cognitive load by introducing routines. We can control participation structures, whether it's one on one, small group, who speaks, who takes turns. We can also, to an extent, control emotional safety, how we treat the students, how they feel in our classrooms. And of course, we can also control goal clarity and instructional variety. Individual differences do not predict success. However, they explain why very rigid instruction fails. This is the key thought I want you to take away from chapter 3.